An orphaned duckling followed a giant python, and his final decision changed everything. What started as a desperate search for survival became an impossible love story between predator and prey. But when fate forced him to choose between his own life and the family he'd found, he made a decision that would prove love knows no boundaries. This is the story of how a tiny, helpless duckling taught a massive serpent what it truly means to belong, and how one choice rewrote the rules of nature itself. It started like any other morning on the pond. The sun was rising, painting the water gold, and little Pip, a fluffy yellow duckling no bigger than a golf ball, was paddling alongside his mother, his siblings close behind. They were a family, complete, safe, happy. But in a single moment, everything shattered. A shadow moved across the water faster than anything Pip had ever seen. Before his mother could even scream, the crocodile erupted from beneath the surface with a fury that seemed to shake the entire pond. Chaos exploded around him. Feathers scattered like snow. Water churned red. His siblings scattered in every direction, their tiny quacks turning into screams of pure terror. Pip bolted. His little legs pumped as fast as they could carry him, splashing through the shallows, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst through his chest. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The sounds behind him, the thrashing, the silence that followed, told him everything he needed to know. He was alone. For 3 days, Pip wandered the marshlands in a daze. His feet were bleeding. His throat was parched. The sun beat down on him relentlessly, and every shadow made him flinch, convinced the crocodile was coming back to finish what it started. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept. He was just existing, surviving, but barely. On the 4th day, his legs gave out. Pip collapsed in the mud at the edge of a dense jungle, too weak to move, too exhausted to care anymore. His breathing was shallow. His vision was blurring. This was it. This was how it would end. Alone, terrified, forgotten. No family to mourn him. No one would even know he existed. He closed his eyes and waited for the darkness to take him. That's when he heard it. A sound like wind through grass, a rustling that grew louder and louder. Pip's eyes snapped open, and for a moment, his heart stopped completely. Slithering toward him through the mud was the most massive creature he'd ever seen. A python. Easily 20 feet long, with scales that shimmered like liquid gold in the sunlight. Its head was the size of Pip's entire body. This was it. This was death coming for him. Pip tried to move, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed, not just by fear, but by exhaustion, by hunger, by the crushing weight of everything he'd lost. He lay there, trembling, as the python drew closer and closer. The serpent's head lowered until it was just inches from Pip's face. Those ancient, intelligent eyes studied him with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through him. Pip could feel the python's breath, warm and steady. He could smell the earth on its scales. This was the end. But then something extraordinary happened. The python didn't strike. It didn't crush him. Instead, it gently, so gently, wrapped a coil around Pip's tiny body and lifted him off the ground. The duckling was cradled against the serpent's warm scales, and for the first time in 4 days, he felt safe. What Pip didn't know was that this moment would change his entire life. What he didn't know was that the creature he'd expected to kill him would become the only family he had left. What he didn't know was that this impossible bond would teach him something about love and loyalty that no one would ever believe. But the python knew something Pip didn't, and that knowledge would set in motion a chain of events that neither of them could have predicted. Retention hook. For the next few weeks, the python did something extraordinary. He became Pip's protector, his teacher, his everything. But neither of them realized they were running toward a future that would test their bond in ways that would shatter them both. The python's name was Ka. At least, that's what Pip started calling him in his mind. It felt right somehow, ancient and powerful, matching the quiet wisdom in those golden eyes. For the first week, Pip lived in a state of constant confusion. Every instinct in his tiny body screamed at him to run, to flee from this predator that could swallow him whole without effort. But his body was too weak, and somewhere deep inside, Pip sensed something that overrode his primal fear. Ka wasn't going to hurt him. The python carried Pip deeper into the jungle, away from the marshlands and the memories of that terrible day. He found a cave, dry, sheltered, hidden from the world. And there, Ka did something that seemed impossible for a creature of his nature. He took care of him. On the first night, Ka caught fish from a nearby stream and regurgitated them into a small pool of water for Pip to eat. The duckling hesitated, his instincts rebelling at the very idea. But hunger won, and he ate. The next day, Ka showed him where the freshest insects lived under the rocks. The day after that, he led him to a grove of fruit trees heavy with ripe mangoes. Ka was teaching him how to survive. But more than that, he was teaching him how to trust. There was a moment, about 2 weeks in, when Pip truly understood what was happening. He'd wandered away from the cave, just a little bit, just to explore, and suddenly found himself face to face with a jaguar. The big cat's eyes were fixed on him, hungry and predatory. Pip's heart seized with terror. This was it. This was the end. But before the jaguar could move, Ka erupted from the jungle behind him like a living lightning bolt. The python's body coiled around the jaguar with incredible speed and power. The big cat thrashed and snarled, but it was no match for Ka's strength and precision. Within seconds, the jaguar fled into the undergrowth, wounded and terrified. Ka turned to Pip, his scales slightly disheveled from the fight, and lowered his head. The python had just risked his own life to protect him. From that moment on, something shifted between them. Pip stopped seeing Ka as a predator to be feared. Instead, he saw a guardian, a protector, someone, something that cared about him. And Ka, in turn, seemed to have set aside whatever ancient instincts told him that a duckling was prey. Instead, the python treated Pip with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible for a creature of his size and power. They developed routines. Every morning, Pip would wake up curled against Ka's warm body, safe and comfortable. During the day, they would explore the jungle together. Pip waddling along while Ka slithered beside him, always staying close enough to protect him, but never crowding him. At night, they would return to the cave, and Ka would wrap himself protectively around Pip, creating a living fortress of scales and muscle. Pip learned to read Ka's moods through the subtle shifts in his body language. When the python's scales would shimmer a certain way, it meant danger was near. And Pip would press himself against Ka's body, safe in the knowledge that nothing could touch him. When Ka's movements were slow and relaxed, it meant it was time to play, to explore, to simply exist together in the moment. And Ka learned Pip's language too. The duckling's different quacks meant different things: hunger, joy, fear, contentment. The python began to respond to each one, adjusting his behavior accordingly. When Pip quacked in a high, excited pitch, Ka would take him on adventures through the jungle. When Pip made a soft, low sound, Ka would settle down and let the duckling rest against his body. But there was always an undercurrent of tension beneath this impossible harmony. Other animals didn't understand their bond. A monkey troop once attacked Pip, seeing him as an easy meal. Kaa defended him so viciously that the monkeys fled and never returned to that part of the jungle. A snake, a venomous cobra, once slithered into their cave at night. Kaa drove it out with such fury that the entire jungle seemed to hold its breath. Pip's own kind didn't understand either. Once, a flock of wild ducks passed through the jungle, and Pip felt something stir inside him. A pull toward them, a sense of recognition. They looked like him. They sounded like him. They were his people. But when Pip took a few tentative steps toward them, Kaa's body went rigid. The python didn't try to stop him physically, but his presence, that quiet, powerful presence, was enough. Pip turned back, because despite the pull toward his own kind, his heart belonged here, with Kaa. The ducks flew away, and Pip never saw them again. 3 months passed, then 6, then a year. Pip grew, stronger. His feathers became glossier, his body more robust. He was no longer a helpless, starving orphan. He was thriving. And Kaa seemed to thrive alongside him, as if the act of caring for Pip had given his massive, ancient life new meaning. One night, as they lay together in their cave with the sounds of the jungle humming all around them, Pip realized something profound. He loved this creature. Not in spite of the fact that Kaa was a python and he was a duck, but because of it. Because Kaa had chosen him. Because Kaa had set aside his nature to protect him. Because Kaa had become his family. And looking into Kaa's eyes, the duckling saw something that told him the feeling was mutual. They were bound now, in a way that transcended nature itself. They were family. But neither of them knew that their bond was about to be tested in ways that would shatter everything they'd built together. For the first time in his life, Pip felt truly safe, truly loved, truly home. But paradise never lasts, and the jungle had a way of punishing those who dared to defy its rules. It started with a sound. One morning, as Pip and Kaa were exploring a part of the jungle they hadn't visited in months, the duckling heard it. A sound that made his entire body go rigid. Quacking, duck quacking. Not just one or two, but many. A whole flock. The sound was unmistakable. The collective calls of dozens of birds moving together, communicating with each other in a language that was written into Pip's very DNA. Pip's heart began to race uncontrollably. His wings trembled with an intensity he hadn't felt since he was a helpless orphan. Every cell in his body was suddenly alive with a feeling he hadn't experienced since that terrible day by the pond. The feeling of belonging to something larger than himself. It was as if some dormant part of him, a part he'd tried to suppress over the past year, was suddenly screaming to be acknowledged. Kaa, Pip quacked softly, his voice uncertain and trembling. Do you hear that? The python's body stiffened beside him immediately. Kaa had heard it too. The massive serpent's scales seemed to shimmer with tension, and his movements became more deliberate, more controlled. Unlike the last time a flock had passed through their territory, nearly 8 months ago. This time, they weren't just passing through. They were staying. Pip could hear them settling into a nearby lagoon, their calls echoing through the trees with a familiarity that made something deep inside him ache with a longing he couldn't quite name. The sound grew louder and more complex. Pip could distinguish individual voices now, some higher-pitched, some lower. He could hear the rhythmic splashing of water as the ducks dove and surfaced. He could hear the gentle quacking that seemed to be some kind of communication, a language of connection that he suddenly realized he'd been missing his entire life with Kaa. We should go back to the cave. Ka said quietly. His voice, when he spoke in the human tongue that Pip had somehow learned to understand over their years together, was calm and measured. But there was an unmistakable edge to it, a warning that cut through the air like a blade. It's not safe to be near them. Just for a moment, Pip said, his little legs already beginning to move toward the sound without his conscious permission. Just to see what they're like. Just to understand. No, Ka said firmly, his massive body shifting to partially block Pip's path. It's not safe. Trust me. We need to leave. Now. But Pip had already made up his mind, even though every rational part of him knew he should listen to Ka. The python had never steered him wrong before. Ka had always protected him, always guided him, always known what was best. But this pull, this inexplicable primal pull toward the sound of his own kind, was stronger than logic, stronger than gratitude, stronger than anything Pip had ever felt before. His little feet were already moving toward the sound, drawn by something ancient and irresistible. This was his chance to see what he might have become if that crocodile had never attacked. His chance to understand what it meant to be part of his own kind. His chance to feel, just for a moment, what it would have been like to grow up surrounded by ducks instead of a single, solitary python. Ka followed him, of course. The python always followed. But his movements were tense and jerky, his body coiled tight with something that might have been fear, or might have been anger, or might have been something far more complicated. A mixture of emotions that Pip was only beginning to understand. The duckling could feel the shift in the air between them, could sense that they were crossing some invisible line that, once crossed, might change everything between them forever. They reached the edge of the lagoon, pushing through the dense vegetation, and Pip's breath caught in his throat so suddenly that he nearly choked. There must have been 50 ducks there, maybe more, perhaps 70 or 80. They were paddling through the water with an ease and grace that Pip suddenly realized he'd never quite mastered, despite all his time with Ka. Their movements were synchronized in a way that spoke of years of practice together, of shared experiences and collective knowledge passed down through generations. They were diving for food with a precision that was almost choreographed, their bodies moving in perfect unison as they searched the bottom of the lagoon for insects and plants. They were calling to each other constantly with voices that were almost identical to his own. A symphony of quacks and chirps that created a sense of community and belonging that Pip had never experienced. He watched as they preened each other's feathers, as they huddled together for warmth, as they moved as one unified organism rather than as individuals. It was beautiful. It was everything he'd lost. And then, one of them saw him. It was a female duck, sleek and beautiful, with feathers that caught the sunlight like burnished copper. Her plumage was pristine and well-maintained, and there was an intelligence in her eyes that immediately marked her as someone important, perhaps a leader of the flock. She paddled toward the shore with purposeful strokes, her head tilted curiously, studying this strange duck she'd never seen before. "Hello there," she called out, her voice warm and welcoming. "Are you lost? We haven't seen you before. My name is Melody. Where are you from?" Pip's heart was pounding so hard, he thought it might burst right through his chest. His throat felt dry, and his mind was racing with 1,000 different responses, none of which seemed adequate. I'm... He didn't know what to say. How could he explain? How could he make them understand the impossible life he'd been living? How could he possibly put into words the bond he shared with Ka? "Come join us," another duck called out. A younger male with bright eyes and an enthusiastic energy that seemed infectious. The water is perfect today. We're heading downstream in a few days. There's a beautiful lake about a week's journey from here. The water is crystal clear, and there's food everywhere. You should come with us." A third duck, an older female with gray streaks through her feathers, added her voice to the chorus. "Yes, please join us. We always have room for one more. There's safety in numbers, you know. Out here, alone, you're vulnerable to predators. But with us, you'll be protected. A week's journey. A lake, other ducks, a real family." The words hung in the air like a promise, like a dream that Pip had thought was lost forever. Everything Pip had ever lost was suddenly being offered back to him on a silver platter. He took a step toward the water, his legs moving almost of their own accord. Behind him, he felt Kaa's presence shift dramatically. The python had moved closer, his massive body now positioned between Pip and the other ducks. It wasn't a threatening gesture, exactly. Kaa made no move to strike or to intimidate. But it was a clear one. A statement. A boundary. "Pip," Kaa said quietly, his voice so low that only the duckling could hear, pitched below the range of the other ducks' hearing. "Don't. Please don't do this. I'm asking you as family. Don't leave me." The desperation in Kaa's voice was heartbreaking. It was a sound Pip had never heard from the python before. Vulnerability, fear, the raw emotion of someone facing the possibility of losing everything they loved. The female duck's eyes widened as she noticed Kaa for the first time, her gaze traveling up the massive serpent's body, taking in the sheer size and power of him. "Oh my God," she gasped, her voice shifting from welcoming to terrified in an instant. "A python! Everyone, get back! Get back! There's a predator!" The lagoon erupted into absolute chaos. Ducks scattered in every direction, their calls of alarm echoing through the jungle with such intensity that birds in the trees above took flight. Some of the ducks dove underwater, their instincts telling them to hide. Others paddled frantically toward the opposite shore. The beautiful female duck that had spoken to Pip paddled backward rapidly, her eyes wide with primal terror as she stared at Kaa. And then she looked at Pip with an expression of absolute horror and disgust that seemed to pierce right through his heart. "You're with him?" she said, her voice dripping with revulsion and incomprehension. "You're actually traveling with that monster? What are you, some kind of traitor to your own kind? How could you possibly choose to be with a predator? Don't you understand what he is? Don't you understand what he wants?" The words hit Pip like a physical blow, each one landing with the force of a stone. Traitor. That's what she saw when she looked at him. Not a survivor. Not someone who'd found love and safety and meaning. Not a creature who transcended the boundaries of nature itself. A traitor. A fool. A creature who had betrayed his own species for the sake of a monster. "It's not like that," Pip tried to explain, his voice barely a whisper, almost lost beneath the continuing chaos of the fleeing ducks. "You don't understand. He saved my life. He raised me. He's my family." "Come with us," another duck called out desperately, paddling toward Pip even as he kept a wary distance from Kaa. "Leave that thing behind. Come back to your real family. Come back to where you belong. We can protect you. We can show you what it means to be part of a real community." "He's a predator!" Yet another duck screamed. "He'll kill you. He'll eat you. How don't you see that?" "Please," the older female duck called out, her voice shaking with fear. "Please come with us. We'll keep you safe." Pip looked at the ducks. He looked at the lagoon with its crystal clear water and its abundance of food. He looked at the life that could have been his. A normal life, a safe life. a life surrounded by his own kind. He imagined what it would be like to grow up with them, to learn their ways, to be part of their flock. He imagined the warmth of their companionship, the security of their numbers, the comfort of belonging to something that made evolutionary sense. And then he looked back at Ka. The python's eyes were unreadable, his expression carefully controlled. But Pip could see something there that broke his heart to 1,000 pieces. Ka was waiting for Pip to choose, waiting to see if his love was enough to keep the duckling by his side, or if the call of his own kind would prove stronger, waiting to see if everything they'd built together over the past year meant anything at all. In that moment, Pip understood the weight of what he was about to do. He understood that this choice would define him, that it would determine not just his future, but the future of his relationship with Ka as, well. No, Pip said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. I'm not leaving. This is where I belong. He turned his back on the lagoon and walked toward Ka, each step feeling like an eternity. As he did, he heard the female duck's voice one more time, filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. You're choosing to stay with a predator? You're insane. You're absolutely insane. But Pip wasn't insane. He was choosing love. He was choosing the creature who had saved his life, who had raised him with patience and gentleness, who had become his family in every way that mattered. He was choosing Ka, even though he was beginning to understand the cost of that choice. They walked back to the cave in profound silence. The jungle seemed to hold its breath around them, as if nature itself was watching this moment, waiting to see what would happen next. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of small animals, the distant calls of other creatures, all seemed muted, as if the world was respecting the weight of what had just transpired. And for the first time since they'd met, that silence felt heavy, weighted with something unspoken, weighted with doubt and fear and the terrible knowledge that they had just crossed a line from which there might be no return. That night, as Pip curled against Ka's body in their cave, he realized something terrible. He had just made a choice that could never be unmade. He had turned his back on his own kind, on the possibility of a normal life, on everything that evolution and instinct had been screaming at him to want. He had chosen love over survival. He had chosen one creature over his entire species. And he'd done it for love. But as the days passed, days that felt like weeks, weeks that felt like months, Pip began to notice changes in Ka. The python was quieter than usual. He spent long hours staring out at the jungle, his massive body coiled in the entrance of the cave, his eyes distant and unfocused. When Pip tried to engage him, tried to play or explore or simply connect, Ka would respond. But there was no joy in it anymore. It was mechanical, obligatory. The movements of a creature going through the motions of living rather than truly living. Ka stopped hunting for himself. Instead, he would catch food for Pip and then retreat to the back of the cave, barely eating anything. His scales, once brilliant and shimmering, began to lose their luster. His movements became slower, more labored. Pip tried to comfort him, tried to remind him of their bond. But Ka would simply wrap himself around the duckling in a way that felt more like an embrace of desperation than an expression of love. One night, about 2 weeks after the encounter with the flock, Pip woke to find Ka gone. The duckling's heart seized with panic so intense that he could barely breathe. His little feet carried him out of the cave as fast as they could move, and he waddled through the jungle in the darkness, quacking frantically, searching for any sign of his companion. Every shadow seemed to hide danger. Every sound made him jump. He found Ka at the edge of the lagoon where the ducks were still staying, watching them from the shadows of the overhanging vegetation. The python was perfectly still, his massive body barely visible in the darkness. But his eyes, his ancient, intelligent eyes, were fixed on the sleeping ducks with an expression that Pip couldn't quite interpret. "Ka," Pip called out softly, his voice trembling with a mixture of relief and fear. The python turned to look at him slowly, as if he'd been pulled back from a great distance. And in his eyes, Pip saw something that terrified him more than anything he'd ever seen before. Doubt. And something worse. Resignation. "I'm holding you back," Ka said quietly, his voice hollow and devoid of the warmth Pip had come to associate with it. "You saw it in their eyes. You're not supposed to be with me. You're supposed to be with them. You're supposed to be living the life you were meant to live, surrounded by your own kind, doing the things that ducks do." "No," Pip said firmly, waddling closer to Ka. "I choose you. I will always choose you. Don't you understand? You're my family. You're my home. Nothing else matters." But even as he said the words, Pip wondered if they were true, and he wondered if Ka believed them. Because deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, Pip knew that part of him, a part he'd been trying to suppress, still longed for the life he'd seen in that lagoon. Still wondered what it would have been like to be part of something normal, something natural, something that made sense in the eyes of the world. And Ka, with his ancient wisdom and his ability to read the truth in Pip's heart, could see that doubt as clearly as if the duckling had spoken it aloud. "You're lying," Ka said softly, and the sadness in his voice was almost unbearable. "Not to me, to yourself. And I can't ask you to do that. I can't ask you to deny your nature, your instincts, your very essence, just to stay with me. That's not love. That's slavery." "It's not slavery," Pip protested desperately. "It's choice. It's my choice." "A choice made under duress is not a choice," Ka said. "And I've become your duress. I've become the thing that's keeping you from your true life. And I can't. I won't be that for you anymore." The crack in their paradise had appeared, and once a crack begins to form, it only gets bigger. Pip had made his choice. But as he watched Ka retreat deeper into himself, as he saw the light fading from those ancient eyes, he began to realize that love wasn't always enough. Sometimes, the most painful act of love was letting go. And sometimes, the greatest sacrifice wasn't giving up your life for someone else. It was learning when to let them go. The days that followed were some of the most agonizing Pip had ever experienced. Worse, in some ways, than the days after the crocodile attack. Because this pain wasn't the sharp, sudden agony of loss. This was a slow, creeping erosion, a gradual dissolution of everything that had made his life meaningful. Ka began to spend entire days away from the cave. At first, Pip told himself it was normal. The python needed to hunt. He needed space. He needed time to process his emotions. But as the days stretched into weeks, Pip began to understand the truth. Ka was pulling away, deliberately, methodically, creating distance between them not out of anger, but out of a kind of twisted mercy, an attempt to make it easier for Pip to eventually leave. The duckling would wait in the cave, his heart racing every time he heard a sound, hoping it was Ka returning. But the python would only come back late at night, long after Pip had fallen asleep, and he would leave again before dawn. They barely spoke anymore. The easy companionship they'd shared, the playfulness, the comfortable silences, the constant physical affection had been replaced by a cold politeness that was far more devastating than any argument could have been. One morning, about 3 weeks after the encounter with the flock, Pip decided he couldn't take it anymore. He had to do something. He had to try to fix what was breaking between them. He had to make Ka understand that his choice to stay was real, that it wasn't born from confusion or desperation, but from genuine love. He spent the entire day preparing. He gathered the most delicious fruits from the trees they'd discovered together over the years. He found a sunny spot near the cave entrance and arranged them carefully, creating a kind of feast. He cleaned the cave, organizing their space in a way that felt intentional and purposeful. He even found some flowers, beautiful purple orchids that grew near the waterfall, and arranged them around the fruit. It was a declaration, a statement, a way of saying, this is what we have. This is what matters. This is worth fighting for. When Ka returned that evening, the python stopped in his tracks at the entrance to the cave. His massive body went completely still as he took in the scene before him, the fruit, the flowers, the obvious care that Pip had taken to create something beautiful. For a moment, Pip thought he saw something flicker in Ka's eyes, something that might have been hope, something that might have been a willingness to believe that they could find their way back to each other. But then the python turned away. "You shouldn't have done this," Ka said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "This doesn't change anything, Pip. This doesn't change what needs to happen." "What needs to happen?" Pip asked, his voice rising in pitch. "Ka, what are you talking about? Nothing needs to happen. We can go back to how things were. We can—" "No, we can't," Ka interrupted, and there was a finality in his tone that made Pip's heart stop. "We can never go back. We can only go forward. And going forward means accepting the truth. I'm not good for you. I never was. I was just convenient. I was just there when you needed someone to survive." "That's not true," Pip cried out, his voice cracking with emotion. "You know that's not true. You're everything to me." "And that's the problem," Ka said, turning to face the duckling. In the fading light of the evening, Pip could see tears, actual tears, glistening on the python's scales. "That's exactly the problem. I've become everything to you. Your entire world, your entire life. And that's not healthy, Pip. That's not love. That's dependency. And I can't be responsible for that anymore." Pip felt something break inside him. "So what are you saying? Are you leaving me? Are you just going to abandon me like everyone else did?" The words hung in the air between them, cruel and desperate and absolutely true in their cruelty. Ka's entire body seemed to deflate. "I'm saying that you need to go back to the flock. I'm saying that you need to live the life you were meant to live. I'm saying that I'm going to make it easy for you by leaving first." "No," Pip quacked, waddling toward Ka as fast as his little legs could carry him. "No, you can't do this. You can't just decide for both of us. This is my choice, and I choose you. I choose this. I choose us." But Ka had already turned away, his massive body moving toward the cave entrance with a determination that Pip recognized as final. The python paused for just a moment at the threshold, and when he spoke again, his voice was so quiet that Pip almost didn't hear him. "I love you, Pip. That's why I have to let you go." And then he was gone. Pip stood alone in the cave, surrounded by the fruit and flowers he'd so carefully arranged, and he understood the true meaning of heartbreak. It wasn't the sharp pain of sudden loss. It was this: the slow realization that the person you loved had decided you were better off without them. It was the knowledge that love itself could become a cage, and that sometimes the most loving thing someone could do was to set you free. He waited through the night, convinced that Ka would return. The python always came back. That was their pattern. That was their truth. But morning came, and Ka did not. Pip spent the entire next day searching for him. He waddled through the jungle, calling out Ka's name over and over, his voice growing hoarser with each cry. He searched the places they'd explored together. He searched the waterfall where they'd bathed. He searched the clearing where they'd watched sunsets together. He searched everywhere, his little heart breaking a little more with each empty location. By evening, Pip was exhausted, heartbroken, and utterly alone. He returned to the cave as darkness fell, and he curled up in the spot where Ka usually slept, wrapping himself in the memory of the python's warmth. And for the first time since that terrible day by the pond, Pip cried. He cried for his lost family. He cried for the life he'd never had. He cried for Ka and for the sacrifice the python had made in the name of love. 3 days passed, then 4, then a week. Pip barely ate, he barely moved. He simply lay in the cave, staring at nothing, existing in a state of profound grief. The jungle seemed to sense his pain. The usual sounds of life, the chirping of birds, the rustling of animals, the whisper of wind through leaves, all seemed muted, as if nature itself was mourning alongside him. On the 8th day, as Pip lay in his usual spot, barely conscious, he heard a familiar sound, quacking, multiple ducks calling to each other. The flock had returned to the lagoon. Pip lifted his head slowly. Part of him wanted to ignore the sound, to stay in the cave and waste away. But another part of him, the part that Ka had been trying to save, stirred to life. That part remembered what it was like to hear his own kind. That part remembered the warmth of companionship, the security of numbers, the comfort of belonging. Slowly, painfully, Pip got to his feet. He walked out of the cave for the first time in a week. His legs were weak, and his feathers were matted and dirty. But he walked toward the sound anyway, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't hope, exactly. It was more like an acceptance, an understanding that Ka had been right, that sometimes love meant letting go. When he reached the edge of the lagoon, the female duck, Melody, saw him immediately. Her eyes widened with a mixture of shock and concern. "Pip!" she called out, paddling toward him. "Oh my God, Pip, where have you been? We've been so worried about you. We thought something terrible had happened to you." Pip started to say, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain? How could he possibly put into words the journey he'd been on, the love he'd experienced, the sacrifice that had been made for him? "Come," Melody said gently, reaching Pip and nudging him toward the water. "Come swim with us. You look like you could use some care." And Pip, broken and grieving and utterly lost, allowed himself to be led into the water. As he swam alongside the other ducks, surrounded by their warmth and their companionship, he thought about Ka. He thought about the python's sacrifice. He thought about the most painful act of love, the act of letting someone go. But even as he swam with the flock, even as he began to feel the first tentative stirrings of healing, Pip knew the truth. He would never be the same. A part of him would always belong to the cave. A part of him would always belong to Ka, and he would spend the rest of his life wondering if the python had found peace in his sacrifice, or if he was out there in the jungle somewhere, grieving just as deeply as Pip was grieving now. Pip had rejoined his own kind. He had the life that Ka had wanted for him. But as he floated on the lagoon with the other ducks, surrounded by everything he'd thought he wanted, he realized that Kaa's sacrifice had come at a cost that neither of them could truly afford. And somewhere in the jungle, a lonely python was learning that sometimes saving someone you love means losing them forever. Kaa walked deeper into the jungle than he had ever ventured before. The python moved with a purposefulness that belied the emptiness inside him. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to go somewhere, anywhere that wasn't the cave. Anywhere that didn't hold the memory of Pip's small, warm body curled against his scales. Anywhere that didn't echo with the sound of the duckling's contented quacking. The jungle, which had once felt like home, now felt like a prison. Every tree reminded him of an adventure he'd shared with Pip. Every clearing brought back memories of them playing together in the dappled sunlight. Every waterfall was a place where he'd bathed while Pip splashed nearby, his tiny wings flapping with joy. Kaa had made the right decision. He knew that with absolute certainty. Pip belonged with his own kind. Pip deserved a life that made sense, a life that wasn't built on the foundation of an impossible bond with a predator. Pip deserved to experience all the things that ducks were meant to experience, to fly in formation with others, to build nests, to find a mate, to create a family of his own kind. But knowing he'd made the right decision didn't make it hurt any less. 3 weeks into his self-imposed exile, Kaa found himself in a part of the jungle he'd never explored before. The vegetation here was denser, the canopy thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was heavy with moisture and the smell of decay, the rich, earthy scent of the jungle's endless cycle of death and rebirth. It was a fitting place for a creature like him, a place where predators belonged, a place where the strong survived and the weak perished, where there was no room for sentiment or love, or the kind of impossible bonds that defied nature itself. Kaa found a cave, not as comfortable as the one he'd shared with Pip, but adequate. He settled into it and tried to return to the life he'd lived before the duckling had come into his world. He hunted, he ate, he slept. He existed in the most basic, primal way possible. But something fundamental had changed inside him. He found that he had no appetite for the kill anymore. He would catch prey, and then he would simply watch it, unable to bring himself to finish the hunt. Eventually, he would let it go, watching it scurry away into the undergrowth. It was inefficient. It was illogical. It was completely unlike anything the old Kaa, the Kaa from before Pip, would have done. One night, about a month after he'd left the cave, Kaa was lying in his new home when he heard a sound that made his entire body go rigid. Quacking. The sound of ducks carried on the wind from somewhere in the distance. Kaa's first instinct was to cover his ears, to block out the sound. But he found himself moving instead, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't resist. He slithered through the jungle toward the sound, moving silently, invisibly, the way a predator moves when stalking prey. But he wasn't hunting. He was searching. It took him nearly an hour to navigate through the dense vegetation. But eventually, Kaa found himself at the edge of a lagoon. Not the same lagoon where Pip had encountered the flock, but another one, further downstream. And there, paddling peacefully through the water, was a flock of ducks. Kaa positioned himself in the shadows, completely hidden from view, and he watched. He watched the ducks dive for food. He watched them preen each other's feathers. He watched them huddle together for warmth as evening fell. He watched them interact with each other in ways that were natural and instinctive, and completely foreign to everything he'd experienced with Pip. And he understood. with a clarity that was almost painful, that he'd made the right decision. This was what Pip was meant for. This was the life the duckling should have been living all along. Not hiding in a cave with a python. Not defying nature. Not sacrificing his own kind for the sake of love. But as Ka watched, he realized something else. He would never be able to return to his old life. The old Ka, the solitary predator, the creature who killed without hesitation, the serpent who saw other animals as nothing more than food or threats, that Ka was dead. Pip had killed him, as surely as if he'd struck a fatal blow. In his place was something new, something that didn't quite fit into the natural order of the jungle, something that was caught between two worlds. The world of the predator and the world of love, belonging, and connection. Ka was a creature without a place. He left the lagoon and continued walking deeper into the jungle. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks blurred into months. Ka moved through the forest like a ghost, present but not truly alive, existing but not really living. He encountered other pythons during his travels. Some tried to establish dominance over him. Others simply ignored him. But Ka found that he couldn't relate to them anymore. They moved through the world with a simplicity that he'd lost. The simplicity of creatures who lived only for survival, who didn't question their place in the hierarchy of nature, who didn't ache with the memory of love. One day, nearly 6 months after he'd left Pip, Ka found himself back at the original lagoon, the one where Pip had made his choice. The flock was no longer there. They'd moved on, following some ancient instinct that told them where to go and when to go there. But Pip was there. The duckling was floating in the water, surrounded by a group of other ducks. He looked healthy. His feathers were glossy and well-maintained. He was interacting with the other ducks in a way that seemed natural and easy. He appeared to be happy. And that should have been enough. That should have been all Ka needed to know that he'd made the right choice. But as Ka watched from the shadows, he saw something that broke what remained of his heart. Pip was alone in the middle of a crowd. He was surrounded by other ducks, but there was a distance between him and them. A subtle separation that suggested he didn't quite belong, even among his own kind. The other ducks would call out to each other with a kind of easy familiarity that Pip didn't seem to share. When they dove for food, Pip would dive a moment too late, as if he was following their lead rather than moving with them. When they huddled together for warmth, there was a small gap around Pip. Not intentional, not cruel, but there nonetheless. Pip had been changed by his time with Ka. The duckling had been marked by their bond in a way that could never be undone. He would never be fully part of his own kind, just as Ka could never fully return to being a solitary predator. They had damaged each other in the process of loving each other, and there was no way to undo that damage. Ka turned away from the lagoon, and he began to walk. He didn't know where he was going, and he didn't particularly care. He just knew that he needed to keep moving, to keep putting distance between himself and the only creature he'd ever loved. As he walked, Ka thought about the nature of sacrifice. He'd always understood sacrifice in the physical sense, the sacrifice of food, of comfort, of safety. But this was a different kind of sacrifice. This was the sacrifice of self. The sacrifice of the possibility of ever being happy again, in exchange for the knowledge that someone you loved was living the life they were meant to live. It was a terrible trade. And yet, Ka couldn't bring himself to regret it. Because somewhere in the jungle, a young duck was learning to live in two worlds. The world of his own kind, the world of the impossible love he'd experienced. And even though that duck would never be completely at home in either world, at least he had the chance to try. At least he had the opportunity to grow and explore and become whatever he was meant to become. And that, Ka supposed, was enough. As the sun set over the jungle, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Ka continued walking deeper into the wilderness. He was a creature without a place, without a purpose, without a home. But he was also a creature who had loved. And that, perhaps, was the only thing that truly mattered. Ka had given Pip the greatest gift, freedom. But in doing so, he'd condemned himself to a lifetime of loneliness, forever haunted by the memory of the only creature who'd ever seen past his predatory nature to the being underneath. The question that remained, unspoken but ever present, was it truly an act of love to let someone go? Or was it simply a more sophisticated form of abandonment? 6 months had passed since Pip rejoined the flock, and the duckling had learned something that no one had ever told him. Belonging and fitting in were two entirely different things. The flock had accepted him without question. Melody, the beautiful copper-feathered duck, who'd first called out to him at the lagoon, had taken him under her wing, quite literally. She showed him the best places to find food. She taught him the migration patterns that the flock followed. She introduced him to the other ducks, made sure he was included in their daily routines. On the surface, everything was perfect. Pip had everything he'd thought he wanted: companionship, safety, a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. But underneath that surface, something was profoundly wrong. The other ducks sensed it. Not consciously, perhaps, but instinctively. There was something different about Pip. Something that set him apart from the rest of them in a way that went beyond mere appearance or behavior. It was as if the duckling carried with him the mark of his time in the cave, a kind of invisible scar that the other ducks could sense but couldn't quite understand. Pip found himself constantly adjusting his behavior to fit in. When the other ducks called out in their particular way, Pip would try to mimic the sound, but it would always be slightly off. A half-second too late, a fraction of a tone different. When they dove for food, Pip would follow, but he'd never quite match their rhythm. When they huddled together for warmth at night, there would always be a small space around him. Not because the other ducks were deliberately excluding him, but because something about his presence made them slightly uncomfortable. One evening, about 3 months into his time with the flock, Pip overheard a conversation between Melody and another duck, a large male named Drake, who seemed to be some kind of informal leader. "There's something strange about that one," Drake was saying, his voice low enough that he thought Pip couldn't hear. "He doesn't quite fit. He moves differently. He acts differently. I'm not sure he's really one of us." "He's a duck," Melody replied, though there was a note of uncertainty in her voice. "He's one of us. He just had a different upbringing, that's all." "Maybe," Drake said, "but I've never seen a duck act the way he does. It's like he's trying to be one of us, but he doesn't really know how. Like he learned about ducks from a book instead of actually being one." Pip had waddled away before hearing any more, but the words had lodged themselves in his heart like splinters. Like he learned about ducks from a book instead of actually being one. It was painfully accurate. Because the truth was, Pip had learned about being a duck from observing the flock. He'd learned it intellectually, through observation and imitation, rather than instinctively, the way the other ducks knew how to be ducks. That night, Pip couldn't sleep. He floated on the water, staring up at the stars, and he thought about Ka, With Ka, Pip had never felt like he was pretending. With the python, he'd never felt the need to adjust his behavior or try to fit in. Ka had accepted him exactly as he was. A duck who was raised by a predator, a creature who defied categorization, a being who existed outside the normal rules of nature. With Ka, Pip had been home, but Pip had given that up. He'd made a choice to rejoin his own kind, and there was no going back from that choice now. As the weeks passed, Pip began to withdraw. He still participated in the flock's activities, but with less enthusiasm. He still interacted with the other ducks, but with less engagement. He was present, but he wasn't really there. It was as if a part of him had remained in that cave, waiting for a python who would never return. Melody noticed the change. One afternoon, as the flock was resting in a quiet cove, she paddled over to Pip and settled beside him. "You're not happy," she said simply. It wasn't a question. Pip didn't respond immediately. He stared out at the water, watching the ripples created by a gentle breeze. "I don't know what happiness is supposed to feel like," Pip finally said. "I thought I did. I thought that being with my own kind would make me happy. But it turns out that belonging to a group and being happy are two very different things." Melody was quiet for a long moment. "Tell me about him," she said finally. "The python. Tell me about what it was like." And so Pip did. He told Melody about the cave, about the waterfall, about the way Ka had looked at him with such tenderness. He told her about the games they'd played, the adventures they'd shared, the quiet moments when they'd simply existed together in perfect contentment. He told her about the day Ka had left, and about the ache that hadn't diminished in all the months since. Melody listened without interrupting. When Pip finally finished, she was quiet for a long time. "That sounds like love," she said softly. "Real love. The kind that changes you." "It was," Pip said. "It is. I don't think that feeling ever goes away." "No," Melody agreed. "I don't think it does. My mother loved a duck before my father. She told me about him once. She said that even though she'd moved on, even though she'd built a life with my father and had children and found happiness, there was always a part of her heart that belonged to that other duck. That some loves don't fade, they just become part of who you are." Pip looked at Melody with new understanding. "Do you think I made the wrong choice, coming back here?" Melody considered the question carefully. "I think you made the choice you felt you had to make. And I think it was probably the right choice for him, for the python. But I'm not sure it was the right choice for you. I think you sacrificed your own happiness for his peace of mind. And I'm not sure that's how love is supposed to work." The words struck Pip like a physical blow. Because they were true. He had made the choice to come back to the flock not because he wanted to, but because he'd seen the pain in Ka's eyes and had wanted to ease it. He'd given up his own happiness to save the python from the guilt of keeping him. But in doing so, he'd condemned himself to a life of longing. That night, Pip made a decision. He waited until the flock had settled down to sleep. Then, quietly, carefully, he slipped away from the group. He paddled away from the lagoon, following the river upstream, retracing the path that he and Ka had taken so many months ago. He didn't know if Ka would still be there. He didn't know if the python would even want to see him. But he knew that he couldn't spend the rest of his life pretending to be something he wasn't. Pretending to be happy with a life that had never truly felt like his own. As Pip paddled through the jungle, following the familiar landmarks, he realized something. Love wasn't about making the other person happy at the cost of your own happiness. Love was about finding someone who made you happy just by existing. Someone who understood you so completely that you didn't have to pretend or adjust or change. Love was Ka, and Pip was going to find him, no matter how long it took, no matter how far he had to search. The jungle welcomed him back like an old friend. The sounds, the smells, the feeling of the water beneath his feet. It all felt like coming home. And as Pip pushed deeper into the wilderness, following instincts he didn't even know he possessed, he began to feel something he hadn't felt in months: hope. Pip had learned the hard way that being part of a group and being truly seen and loved were two entirely different things. And now, with nothing but determination and the memory of a python's love to guide him, the young duck was embarking on a journey that would either reunite him with his greatest love or break him completely. The question was no longer whether Pip belonged with his own kind. The question was whether he had the courage to choose love over safety, connection over community, and one impossible bond over a lifetime of comfortable loneliness.